Good morning again, everybody. It seems like just a minute ago that I was up here. I'm thrilled to welcome you back as we start the day, which we know is an important day. Now we're going to turn our focus to an important part of the conversation, and that is how do we build and finance resilient, sustainable communities. If you look at this panel, this great panel brings together experts from housing, finance, and insurance to explore concrete ways that public and private investments can strengthen resilience, especially for communities that are most vulnerable to climate impacts. We'll discuss strategies, tools, and partnerships that are making a difference today and look at what it will take to scale those solutions in the future. Now, before we dive in, well, I want to thank our MC, who's been great, and I never thought I'd say that, but about anybody associated with the Patriots as a Giants fan, just so you know. All right, it's out on the table now. But let's give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves, and if I could start right on my left, and we'll just go down the line.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. My name is David Erickson. I head the Community Development Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And the comments that I'm going to share with you today are my own. They do not represent the bank. Our new president started about 6 years ago, John Williams, and he looked at the mission statement, which said, Federal Reserve Bank of New York executes monetary policy, we're Central Bank of the United States, and regulates banks. Those two things are true, but he says that's neither accurate nor inspiring. We really do try to foster an economy that works for everyone. That's the goal of the Federal Reserve. And in that effort, we have a community development department that really looks at the needs of low-income communities from multiple angles, including the ways in which we can invest about the $500 billion that's invested every year by banks into low-income communities. If you add on to that the incentives in the tax code, the investment tax credits and the block grants, local sources like tax increment financing, bonds, and things like that, you probably get to another $250 billion. So it's about $750 billion a year invested in communities, and we would love to partner with you on how we can invest that money more wisely to make those communities opportunity rich, but also resilient to climate and healthier.
I have a lot of ideas. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Commissioner, for inviting me. I'm Seila Mosquera-Bruno, Commissioner for Connecticut Department of Housing, and our mission is to ensure that residents in Connecticut have access to quality housing regardless of their income levels and regardless of whether rental housing or home ownership, and especially we're trying to make sure that we build in communities that are resilient, in communities that are out of flood zone. Or if they were in a flood zone, we're actually rebuilding some of those communities, getting out of the flood zone, and I'll explain a little more after when we enter into the conversation. But I do have a lot of ideas for the money that he has, and because the governor and the legislators have put significant amount of resources in the past. Since 2019, we have completed about 14,000 units and investing more than $600 million from the state funding that have generated about $2.4 billion in other public and private investments. Right now, we have about 7,000 units under construction, and some of those units are on some of the previously flood areas, and now they're out of the flood, so that they can be resilient and provide the quality of housing that our residents need. So looking forward to continue conversation.
Hello, I am Dr. Sarah Kapnick. I am the Global Head of Climate Advisory at JP Morgan. Same caveat, these comments are my own, not the bank's. And I provide advisory services around climate science and technology, what we see today and what we expect into the future in terms of science, in terms of tech, in terms of regulation, in terms of geopolitics. And this is all informed by my long career actually prior to the bank, working at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, most recently as the chief scientist. So I'm the chief scientist within a bank, helping people advise what's to come and what to expect.
Hi, my name is Joe Pursley. I had the insurance asset management distribution business for an asset manager called Nuveen. Similar to everyone else, these comments are my own today. But if you're not familiar with Nuveen, we are a $1.3 trillion global asset manager who's wholly owned by TIAA, which is an insurance company started a little over 100 years ago now by Andrew Carnegie to help America's educators retire with dignity. When we think about engaging with insurance companies in the US, we really do that around two core pillars. The first one centers around an insurance company's evolving strategic asset allocation and how they are thinking about solving tomorrow's problems from a balance sheet standpoint. And the second one is around what we would call all things sustainability. And that's coming in, partnering with an insurance company, helping them think through governance structure through a sustainability lens, if that's an area where they are, also helping to think through ESG risk factors that may sit within their balance sheet, and importantly, starting to think about how they can track and grow impact investments and non-financial KPIs that track towards the positive benefit of society and the environment.
Well, welcome all, and I do have to tell you, I remember this is almost a reunion because a number of us were on a panel at Yale that Brian from the Green Bank moderated. Then I had to answer questions. It's a lot easier to just ask them. But we've got some great people here. David, you're with the Fed. And by the way, I do have to say thank you, just so you know. David's got a flight to Chicago. So he came in, he's got to run, but he thought this was important enough to be here, and we really do appreciate that. Let me ask you, we're talking about vulnerable communities. Yeah. These are the communities that are, for various reasons, mainly historical, most vulnerable to the effects of climate risk, but also most likely to not be able to have the economic resources to address that climate risk. Mm-hmm. How can we better direct investments towards resilience and equity in those vulnerable communities? You know, what are the barriers? What are the opportunities?
Sure. And I think, one of the ways in which I think about this is, and I think it might be apocryphal, but it is, you find in many sources that Dwight Eisenhower used to say that when he comes up with a complex problem, what his first impulse is to make it bigger. Because if you make it bigger, you start to see patterns that you might not have seen before. And so I think that's part of the key to that question is this problem is bigger than any one sector. And you all were on that panel to discuss this book, actually, at Yale not too long ago, which was a joint effort between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and two of the largest nonprofit banks in the country, the Local Initiative Support Corporation and Enterprise Community Partners. And in that, and I know you can't see this, but these are heat maps here of Manhattan and the Bronx. And it's basically through three lenses. The first lens is through health and the best summary statistic for health. And you can, if you Google this, what's possible investing now for prosperous, sustainable neighborhoods, you'll see it's on page 357. So this is the, and on this map, you'll see in Manhattan that life expectancy is quite high in the sort of lower area, Greenwich Village, West Side, East Side. But as you move into Harlem and the Bronx, the life expectancy begins to drop. And there's just worse health there. And if you look through another lens, an economic lens, and we did percentage of people living in poverty in those neighborhoods, but we could have picked other variables. It could have been overcrowding in housing. It could have been access to a bank branch. It could have been income. You see the same map. It looks exactly the same. The heat map looks exactly the same. And then we look through an environmental lens. And we looked at heat islands. Where is it hotter on a hot day in New York City? And it turns out it's Harlem and the Bronx. Finally, air quality, same. And so, and thank you, Commissioner Mays. I am running to Chicago. If I miss that flight, it's at 12:30, so it's kind of close. I have a similar set of maps. I'm going to give a similar talk in Chicago to a group called Neighborhood Economics. These are all very small neighborhood groups, churches, nonprofits, community development corporations. That's who I'm speaking with tonight. And I have the same map of Chicago that shows the west side of Chicago and south side of Chicago with the same level of the same overlapping vulnerabilities in economics, in health, and in climate risk. And anywhere you go, and Sarah and I were having this conversation earlier that there, she's done a lot of the mapping on this in places like Dayton to Philadelphia, to New York. She, as a scientist, knows this is true everywhere that you look. And so that has got to be sort of the cornerstone to what we do moving forward, I think, is to try to find those. If we have shared risk, we should have shared value. And if there's shared value, there should be a business model in there somewhere where we can co-invest with these different entities, whether it's health, climate, economic opportunity, to create new business models that go upstream to tackle the root of the problem, to make those places more resilient. And so I think that's the key, but we don't really know how to do it yet. We're not really quite there, and that's why I think conversations like this are so important.
Thank you, David. Commissioner, you've mentioned some of what you've done. You're a national leader in getting resources to communities that have been affected. In addition to what I just asked David, what have been the best practices that you've used to ensure that these communities are not just the beneficiaries of the investment, but decision makers, that they have ownership in this?
Yeah, sure. My background is actually was as a CEO of a nonprofit affordable housing. So by training, I was an organizer and always working with families, especially in the inner cities where health issues and resilience really don't exist because people are living day to day, paycheck by paycheck. So how can they project for what is coming? And my work has been also about educating, and that goes with my staff. So for me, is how do we withstand another event, especially in our neighborhoods? How do we recover, and how do we build sustainable communities? And I'll just give you a brief example. In Bridgeport, when Hurricane Sandy came into play, there was a whole neighborhood, a whole project from public housing that was flooded, and people had to be relocated and move out of their homes. We have invested a lot of resources, but not just the state, the federal government, from raising the area to above the 100-year floodplain, from doing drainage, storm drainage, building a park so the water can flow, and rebuilding that community. So today, it took us many years, but we have built about 263 mixed income units. So the whole neighborhood now is different. The elevation have provided that resiliency for next event that we may have because they're by close to the water. So we know that we have to prepare our families because, when I say prepare, but we'll never be prepared for any events because it will come, as the governor was mentioning, the flood that we had, that people were not in the flood zone, so they didn't have insurance. So how do we make sure that our families understand, even when you are a rental person, you do need to have insurance, even for your personal belongings, because you just get, when we had that relocation of those families in Marina Village in Bridgeport, they lost everything. And we had hundreds of families that had to be relocated. So we're trying to build with that in mind to make sure that we somehow prepared, somehow build resiliency in our communities, and also educating our families.
Jill, let me turn to you. Nuveen's done an awful lot of work with the department, with regulators on this. From the insurance capital side, we've got a whole bunch of people in the room from insurance companies with lots of money to spend. How do we get that money into the communities where it's needed most?
Yeah, I think that's been one of the issues that we've seen the last several years, really going back as far in time as you want with the insurance community, is if you look at it conservatively today, you could say the U.S. insurance balance sheet assets aggregate to somewhere north of $6 trillion. And it's easy to say, well, we should be using more of that for this positive benefit to society, positive benefit to the environment. The problem with that is the insurance sector is an unbelievably competitive sector. And so for us to be able to do that with balance sheet assets, we really first have to be able to achieve our primary goal of maximizing our capital adjusted, risk adjusted return with our balance sheets. We really can't compromise that as an entity. And I think what's happened in the industry is so often people come to insurance companies and they say, well, here, this is a good investment. Can we just have $1 million or can we just have $10 million? But through that insurance lens, it really needs to make sense from a business standpoint. And then if we can get that secondary positive benefit to society and the environment, it kind of feels like, why would we not? But this, again, just my belief is that, as an industry, we haven't spent as much time trying to solve the problem through the insurance company's lens, which is how do you deliver that impact investment or that positive investment that does meet the capital adjusted, risk adjusted criteria. And we've been spending a lot of time thinking about that and doing that, of how can we use things like structured finance, how can we get something that is scalable, number one, so insurance companies can spend the time and actually allocate $20 million, $50 million, $100 million to that type of investment. And how do we make it capital efficient? And the goal there would be, how do you get it on Schedule D, which is where the lion's share of the assets sit. To do that, the investment needs to feel like a bond. It needs to pass the principal-based bond definition. And those are the types of things that I think the insurance community and hopefully the asset management community is starting to think more about, okay, how can we solve these problems through a lens that works for the insurance company? And if we can do that and then back into how do we get those assets to the local community and do that in partnership where they're needed the most, now we can really start to unlock that capital.
Let me come back to you, Commissioner. Joe just mentioned partnerships. What are examples of successful public-private or successful partnerships in financing resilience, whether residential or commercial, that you've seen? Just going to go with the Commissioner first.
So as the governor mentioned, no one agency can help with these events that we have. There is a project in Norwalk. A whole neighborhood was also flooded with Hurricane Sandy. And it took about $120 million, a little more. But we had private investors, we have the federal government, we have the state programs like the low-income housing tax credits. To build, actually, there was about 6 feet higher, where now we have a little over 200 units of, again, mixed income, because we're trying to make sure that we don't concentrate poverty on one side. But that really changed a neighborhood. It transformed a place to make it more resilient. But it was the city of Norwalk, it was the state with resources, several agencies worked in that project. Took many years to get it back. But right now, you drive by and the residents have a safe place to live. Now, the challenge that I find, and now I'm going to my colleagues on insurance, is that when we build housing, and I'm going to call it housing that provides affordable rents, because our housing, when you call about affordable housing, they're very well designed and built, because we have high standards, from energy efficient all the way to all different levels of net zero. But the insurance keeps going up, right? So in a way, one of the challenges that the affordable housing developers and nonprofits and for-profits are having is that every year it continue going up, and the rents that they're charging are not being enough. So in not only insurance, we have other like taxes, but insurance actually, they told me that it's going up about 20%. So there should be a way that we can look at all the elements that we're including in the building and the construction that is not like just the regular builders, that perhaps there should be some concession in working together to see, well, if we are building for resistance of wind because we have a hurricane, right? So we know that we are more protected, not 100%. But how can we get into that level of negotiation or partnership that we can talk a little more and see if we can come out with some solutions or some programs that is more beneficial to the type of work that we're providing.
Sounds like creating more resilient housing should mean that we're lowering the losses So that should be reflected in your premiums. That's
Yeah,
what
insurance guy.
Let me turn to Dr. Kapnick now. Same question. Successful partnerships. What have you seen?
Yeah, I see an issue that was somewhat touched on there and with both of you, that there's misaligned durations with the incentives that require these cross-sector collaborations to be able to realign incentives. So an example of that I mean is if an insurer were to say, I will give you money or money up front to do resilience, but then they have a 2 to 3 year payback period where they need the policyholder to have that policy then at a reduced rate for 3 years to recoup their costs. Because they write annual policies, if a person does resilience, then they can go out to the competitive market and they can shop it, and they might be able to move to a different insurer. And so the insurer that actually incentivized up front that resiliency doesn't actually recoup the costs that they enabled through that incentive. And so I'm starting to see cross-sector and public-private analysis and projects trying to address these gaps. Like there's the program in Alabama for new roofs. There, the insurers all paid in, then they had the resilience spending that took place, and then as a pool, the pool was then more resilient, and then in that competitive pool, the insurers were able to recoup costs. But it requires thinking through how those cross-sector programs can work to make sure it realigns all the incentives, because once resilience is made, people then can go into competitive market to be able to find different insurance. And so if you don't find what those different types of structures are, we end up not aligning incentives, and they do them as one-off, and then you don't see those projects again. And there's many different examples where people have tried to align these incentives, and if you don't figure out how to do it right, they are just a single one-off consulting practice, and then it doesn't happen long-term.
Can I jump in on that incentive
Sure.
question? Because I think that's so the key to what we're talking about here. So like I mentioned before, I'm going to be talking to this group tonight about, they're all neighborhood people. There's the people who run the PTA or the YMCA or their teacher, or they, at this very small level, there's all these people who see the problem as we see it, right? And I think of it in terms of like in the concept in science about fractals, that things are that they behave identically at different scales, right? And so at the neighborhood level, you can think of it almost like an eddy in a stream, that the swirl that you'll see when you look down behaves very similarly to how a hurricane will gather strength in the ocean, and which will look exactly the same way that the Milky Way galaxy will rotate it. And you're sort of at the galaxy level, right? And I was just at a conference for pension funds, for example, where the head of CalSTRS, one of the largest pension funds in the world, said, look, I have 2 goals. One is to make sure that when a California teacher retires, I have enough money to pay her and his retirement. And 2, that they live in neighborhoods that are opportunity rich, right? So how does that person, she has $400 billion that she has to invest. She can't write a check for less than $200 million for an investment, but how do you get it to the YMCA in a neighborhood? How do you align the incentive? So Joe talked about that bond, right? That's a tool that's at the kind of hurricane level, right? That allows the galaxy to talk to the stream, right? And so there are lots of things at the hurricane level that we're exploring. Like my friend Maggie Superchurch, who has the best name in the world, and I thought she was a hippie, but it's just Maggie Super married Bruce Church, so it's not that interesting. But Maggie Superchurch started this thing called the Healthy Neighborhood Equity Fund. And she said, I was motivated by one simple question. Why can I invest in a company that makes a pill that lowers blood pressure, but I can't invest in a neighborhood that does measurably exactly the same thing? So how do we come up with more of the thing, like we're all groupies of Brian Garcia. We think, the resilience improvement districts, I think that's at that's the hurricane level. Tax increment financing is something that's part of our world. That's at the hurricane level. There are lots of ways we could create funds, ready to learn at kindergarten bonds, resiliency bonds, to capture those incentives so that you could start aligning all of those different players' participation in a way that allows for those transactions to work more seamlessly.
By the way, just throwing a commercial here, Strength in Alabama, great program, has been copied all over. We've got some numbers from the last major storms. It really does work. And as I mentioned, we had a resiliency council, or co-chairs will be speaking to the recommendations for Connecticut later, so please stay tuned. But in the meantime, let me move on to climate finance. And we've talked about partnerships, but who are the key actors right now, and how do they collaborate with local governments, with communities? And Joe, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I actually think there's a really good example right here from the state of Connecticut. One of the businesses that we have at Nuveen is called Nuveen Green Capital, is centered around loans called CPACE, which is Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. It was actually started back in 2012 right here at the Connecticut Green Bank. Jessica Bailey and Allie Cooley were working for the bank and said, surely there has to be a way for the commercial buildings in the US for us to be able to retrofit them to make them more environmentally friendly, or to incentivize new commercial buildings to build them from an above code standpoint, from both, again, a utility standpoint, but also from a resiliency standpoint. It's something that worked really well with Connecticut Green Bank, and in 2015 they were able to grow the business so far that then they were able to go into the private sector, set up an entity called Greenworks Lending, domiciled here in Connecticut. And then importantly, to get back to the stuff we were talking about before, in 2017 they were able to do the first securitization, which is, it's great to lend money to people and do it at a small, or to businesses or these commercial properties, and do it at a small scale. But to really make a difference, we have to find a way to aggregate these things into loans that can be unlocked, that now we can tap into institutional capital, tap into insurance capital. And the team's been able to do that over time. So in 2021, Nuveen acquired the business. It's now called Nuveen Green Capital, and I'm happy to say, kind of as of today, we have within the CPACE entity over $4 billion worth of assets under management, where we are doing these loans to commercial buildings to make them more environmentally friendly, and without going too far into it, are able to do it through that incentivization structure that allows them to pay back the loan over a period of time, where they're realizing the cost savings of the investments, instead of needing to pay back the loan in 2 or 3 years, or pay back the loan or pay cash for the loan. We're giving them the proper incentive to be able to do it. And I think is a real success story of how a public-private partnership can ultimately evolve into something that unlocks more private capital at scale.
Now, David, let me turn to you. Joe just mentioned the asset management / insurance side. The people you regulate, the people the Fed regulates, banks. What is the role of the banks in low-income investment and resilience?
Well, I do think across the whole spectrum of investing, I think there are opportunities to invest in sort of climate resilience. So you could think about whether it's cash or cash equivalents, debt, fixed income, guarantees, in the capital appreciation category, public equity, private equity, venture capital, and then even real estate. There are ways in which you can sort of, and again, there's another article about this in the book that I mentioned. And I think the banks that you interact with are eager to participate and try to come up with these funds that make it easier to make those investments across the capital spectrum into communities that are sometimes hard to reach. And the nice thing about that is that they have a relationship with these organizations, with the community development financial institutions, with the sort of smaller entities that are able to deploy the capital at that scale. And so I really would encourage you to think about banks as a partner in this strategy to invest in those places to make them more resilient.
Dr. Kapnick, you're with JP Morgan Chase, not exactly a small bank. I tend to think investments like these is coming primarily from community-related banks. Am I wrong? What's the role of a bank like yours? What's in the sector in general?
Yeah, I think an important thing to remember too is there is access to capital for capital expenditures and upgrades for infrastructure, or for residents to unlock a HELOC and have funding to be able to make home improvements. However, in that availability of funding, that is for what people want to do on their housing or on their commercial real estate. However, it doesn't necessarily track to, are you doing it for resilience? Are you doing it for adaptation? And so there's currently disconnects where we don't know if that spending is happening on that because they've not been structured for that. But I also see this gap of potentially consumers not knowing what they need to do to be able to make those improvements, and then see those improvements flow through into what's happening in insurance. And so I think there's opportunity now on the education that actually has education that leads to action, that in accessing the funding that already exists, for people to actually then know what to do to actually improve their resilience. And I think this will be increasingly be a trend as people see their insurance rates going up and are looking for ways to bring them down. They're going to try and understand how you'd make those connections. And I think banks have a role to play, and I think insurers have a role to play in that as well.
Commissioner.
In my world, well, HUD or the federal government was a big player. Not anymore, because many of the resources that we had lined up went away. But nevertheless, I think, so the state plays a role, the private sector plays a role. And as we saw in the previous flood issue that we had about almost a year ago, 2 years, Rob, about 2 years ago. So we had the insurance company play the role because some families did have insurance. We also work with the banks. And the commissioner of banking was very instrumental to help people to waive payments on their mortgages while they went through the situation. The Small Business Administration with the ECD provided resources to make sure that people could, they needed to rehab their homes right away. And the state played a role. So all together, we were able to address the issues. Now, the governor wanted to be proactive for the next event. So the way that governors work, the government and the bonding works for us is that we have a process, and it takes 3 to 6 months to get the resources. And we took that time. In the way to be proactive, the governor already approved, I have $10 million that is dedicated in hand in our account, that if any event related to housing, we're going to be able to act while we work with insurance company to come to the table, while we work with the financial institution to come to the table, and the residents. So that's the way, and we're not putting any plans together because we don't know what that is going to look like. But we could proactively work with the residents right away.
Dr. Kapnick, I'm going to come back to you again, only because you're the bank that holds my mortgage. So, Neil deGrasse Tyson, great astrophysicist, he once said, "You may not believe in climate change, but your insurance company sure does." Okay, that's a reflection of risk, and part of what we do with investments is we balance risk and return. So I've got a couple of questions on that. One is, what are the most effective tools and models that you see out there for funding climate adaptation? And I think foundational to that is, how do you price risk? How are the markets pricing the risk? What barriers exist?
Yeah, so I was at the forefront of this R&D for a while with the government and public in partnership with the insurance industry. We have all this science over here, and we have the risk modeling that's over here, and it's really only the last few years that climate change and a lot of the climate information is flowing into like the projection of the future instead of just what is the risk today. And I think that is going to continue to accelerate, where more and more of that information is coming in. Looking at all of the risk modeling firms, they're all bringing in climate expertise right now. There are tons of startups in the space. As you mentioned in your remarks, First Street, which has really only been in the last few years, and was a bunch of ex-NOAA scientists that went and built out that information because they saw a gap in the market that was needed. So the models that are out there, there are some nonprofit data sets. There was government data, but there's less federal government data now. Several states are stepping up with their own data sets that are hyper-local for their states so that the states can manage what the risks are. That's starting to go into catastrophe modeling. It's starting to go into risk analysis that goes into real estate information so that the consumer can use that. It's starting to be in the markets in terms of pricing, but it isn't necessarily in the markets. There's only a couple of cases now where actually credit rating agencies use resilient spending to actually upgrade or downgrade companies. So it's not widely across the entire sector. So you don't necessarily get a benefit of spending on resilience if you're a corporate right now. So we're in the early innings, I would say, of that actually flowing into the financial models, that then you actually get the benefit of the resilience funding. Now on how do we incentivize the resilience funding, as discussed on the bond market, there are ways to link bonds to certain outcomes, but that is still a smaller part of the market. There also are the beginnings of, I've seen some muni bond funds that are trying to build resilience, and it has it in it as a general funding mechanism. But I think we're going to see more of it. The munis market does not show differences in actually the pricing between municipal locations that have very different physical risks that could affect their ability to pay back into the future. As more of that knowledge goes into the pricing models, into credit risk, I think we'll start to see some differences, and we'll start to see desires to fund more on resilience to be able to get out of that, where they start getting pricing differentials due to their perceived risks and lack of adaptation funding.
Not to put you on the spot, but I will. Is this a market intelligence failure, or is it simply that we haven't, that by we, I mean lenders, have not kept up or caught up with the current state of science?
I think that the state of science has evolved, and it's now being translated in, and I think we could have a rapid shift over the next few years as that comes in and starts getting priced into the market. And I speak about this a lot, that those investors that are starting to account for it already, they're seeing opportunities because they think things are mispriced in the market right now because of that. And more groups are going to be bringing climate risk in and are going to be analyzing that. And so as that happens, there might be shifts in capital availability.
David, what do you think from your perch and the Fed? You get a wide range of banks that you look at.
Yeah, and we definitely have a group that does a lot of analysis on the risk that's involved to banks, to the financial system. One thing I would just sort of maybe switch directions slightly, though, just to mention that after the fact, there's quite a bit that banks can do, and a lot that community development can do in order to sort of recover after a disaster. So banks, I mentioned before, the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. It was updated in 1995. There was an effort to update it recently, and that was challenged by the banking sector, so that got tabled. But there is still sort of the legacy rule from 1995 that's in effect, and one of the things, banks are asked to sort of make loans back into the places where they take deposits, and of course, since it was written in 1977, it's where they have bank branches. So there's what they call their assessment areas, is where they can make those loans and get credit for it. But for disaster recovery, they can make a loan anywhere in the country. So that's something where, again, they're very much looking for places where they can put those CRA dollars, and so that's something you could be thinking about in terms of a partner for disaster recovery would be the banking sector to get CRA credit. And then there are other tools as well. There's the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. One of the problems with that program, and that's been, I think, $100 billion has been lent out or granted out through that program. I think it's a really effective disaster recovery program, except for the fact that it's slow. So there have been some really interesting innovations lately about bridge loans that are able to sort of Enterprise Community Partners is one of the nonprofit banks that's really on the forefront of that, where they're coming up with new tools where they can upfront the money so you can get the people back into their homes, you can get those communities rebuilt more quickly, more defensively, and then the money gets paid back over time. And so I do think there are lots of ways you can be thinking about the community development sector as your partner as you try to recover from disaster and then make those places more hardened to future calamity.
Commissioner, you'd be on the flip side of that. If something happened, you would be the one reaching out to the banks and to the financial institutions. What have you seen, and has it worked, in your opinion?
I think that when we have a disaster or an event, we all come together, actually. People do want to work, financial institutions do want to work with residents, is how do we bring together, providing the information that they need. And it's not only about money. I mentioned before about the banks and the homeowners. It's about, hey, can you waive 3 months or hold those payments for 3 months because people need to be on their feet again. So that type of arrangements where we sit down and talk, it does happen. The federal government, as I mentioned before, has been one of our partners, and I hope that we continue to be doing that because otherwise we don't have enough resources. And our investors. But I have to confess one thing. I hated insurance.
This is the wrong place to say.
But when I was a developer, I hated it, right? So I had to hire a consultant because I was also doing deals on tax credits. And you know, investors want to be protected 150%. So because I didn't want to be upset, I just hired consultants and said, just keep me safe, and my residents. And I did that, and the first person that I met when I became a commissioner, guess who was that person? The insurance commissioner. We both were hired the same day. So that's something that I needed to be more friendly with insurance. But nevertheless, we have been working also in talking about how can we, the insurance industry, the developers that we bring in, get together and see how can we benefit each other from the programs, but also from the things that we are doing and the insurance company can learn so that we can talk about in affordability when we're trying to put so much resources into affordable housing. And then you have the loans, and then you have the taxes, then you have the insurance. It really is not affordable anymore. For the developers that has to make those units affordable because they're restricted, it's more difficult to be able to meet that operating and the benefits that they give to the residents. So I'm hopeful, and I always have faith that people come together when we have an event and that we are creative and get things done. So always look at the heart of the people, bankers. I know they have a heart.
Joe, I'm going to ask you, and it's a pretty basic question. It's one that builds on what the Commissioner just said. But what role can the insurance sector, the people you see sitting here today, play in accelerating the investments? How can insurance incorporate resilience to reduce costs?
I think one of the best things that the insurance industry brings from an investment standpoint that's not talked about enough is just that it can be unbelievably patient capital. And these are areas that really require that patient capital for the innovation, for the development, for some of these kind of more early stage things that are happening. However, that creates a challenge because the issue with that is how do you get patient capital through that capital efficient, risk adjusted lens that works from them. And I think that's one of the things we're most excited about from kind of an investment landscape today as we sit here in 2025, as you've probably heard the word complexity thrown around from time to time. And I think sometimes complexity can be potentially a negative thing for investments. Sometimes complexity can be a potentially positive thing for investment. And one of the areas where we're spending time is thinking about how can you use the complexity lever to basically dissect investments into certain categories that make sense and work for an insurance company, and then certain categories that make sense for some other type of investor. Neither one of those need to be bad investments. It just needs to be identifying the parts of the risk that the entity wants and create an opportunity for insurance companies to provide the patient capital that ultimately gets to these areas at scale in partnership with another investor. And in the past, that would have been done really almost exclusively through public-private partnerships. What we're starting to see more now and what we're excited about is really kind of the growth and the interest of what we would call catalytic capital. And think family offices, endowments, foundations, And this is not philanthropic capital, so there is a financial return that they want to generate. But in addition to that, they really want to maximize the positive benefit to society and environment that their investment dollars can have. And so what we're starting to work on now, and it's in its early days, and again, it's the complexity factor is definitely there, but how can we pair catalytic capital with insurance capital to really start to unlock the insurance piece at scale, and do so with a partner that many years ago you wouldn't have thought, okay, well, these are natural partners. But when it comes to that positive benefit to society, the positive benefit to environment, they're really naturally very aligned. And through education and complexity, we think there's a real opportunity for the insurance industry to do a lot more in the future with their balance sheet assets.
Dr. Kapnick?
And to my previous point, it's because they're so long duration, they can wait 10 to 20 to 30 years, that you can actually make very different choices about what you're doing. I also wanted to add to the other point, a trend that I'm seeing is that insurers are putting out more and more information based on what the risks are from their own risk models. There's becoming more transparency and availability of that data. And it's been incredibly powerful in making people realize that they have resilience that they should be doing by accessing that data from the insurers themselves and their pricing model that previously was not necessarily available years before. And I think that's pushing people to realize it's creating information, education, but also transparency and figuring out what does one need to do to invest in resilience to be able to get benefits potentially in the pricing mechanism back from the insurers. And I'm seeing this trend starting at the reinsurers, but it's also starting to happen in the broader insurers that are able to pool all the information to actually pinpoint what the extreme weather and climate risks are.
Can I jump on that just for a second?
I was just going to tell you, I don't want you to miss your flight, so.
Yeah, no, I know, I'm gonna have to sneak off. But this idea of like this catalytic capital, I mean, you might think of that as just a bunch of do-gooders, but the Global Impact Investing Network has an assessment. They think it's about $1.5 trillion assets under management in that category. So it's not small. And the other thing that hasn't come up as much, but I think something to consider are, like sometimes I dream of being wealthy, and the business I would start would be to start a reinsurance company, because you got me thinking about that, Sarah, about how I would buy the downstream catastrophic risk of a location, and then I would just manage the hell out of the upstream, you know. And in that regard, I think you should really be thinking about who owns the downstream medical care cost risk for the area you're concerned about, because there's a big payer there who might be in the position to be a co-investor to try to make those communities more resilient and healthier, which will save them money. And I think about places like, if you have an integrated system like a Kaiser Permanente in Hawaii, for example, like they pretty much own the downstream medical care cost risk for the island of Maui, for example. And that's an instance where when they realized that, they started investing in preschools and thinking about flooding and thinking about these other issues that may not, so you may not be thinking about a health payer as a partner, but I think they're really a powerful player in this conversation.
Well, thank you all. I want to thank somebody who's not on the stage, Francis Bouchard, who was originally scheduled to be the moderator here. Unfortunately, Francis has COVID, but the good thing, great person, he wanted me to make sure I shared that with you, reminded you the vaccines are here. Go get vaccinated, please. And that said, thank you all for being here. The panelists have been great. Please give them a round of applause.
Good to meet you, Dave.
Oh, sorry.